Dr. Martin Luther King's August of 1963 letter from Birmingham jail addressed a public statement of concern and caution that was issued by 8 white community leaders of the South. These 8 community leaders called Dr. King and other peaceful protesters protesting unwise and untimely. These leaders stood by watching African Americans be treated poorly, unfair, and unjust, all while calling themselves leaders in their communities. These same leaders looked at African Americans as threats and rebels when all they were doing were trying to make a change. Dr. Martin Luther King went on in his letter to discuss how peaceful protesters were technically not breaking laws, being the reason he was locked in the Birmingham jail, but the laws themselves were only made to protect the majority and affect the minorities, just as they affect the African Americans. He stated how he had no issue with following the laws, but they were wrongly applied on African Americans taking peaceful stands against unjust actions. Dr. King also stated how these 8 white leaders felt that their white officers handled peaceful protests in good and fair ways, and Dr. King did not agree. He stated they were assaulted by vicious dogs who bit several people at the hands of these officers. After reading the letter from Birmingham jail, I instantly thought back to police brutality rallies that have been going on in the last few years when it comes to innocent African Americans being killed by officers who are a part of the law. These same New Age rallies where people wanting justice and equality are being called unruly and rebels and or claimed to be causing disturbances just as the protesters in the civil rights era were referred to. And it posed a question in my mind. Although African Americans were eventually given equal rights numerous years ago, in recent situations where peaceful protesters protesting unjust in their communities are being attacked and incarcerated, can't we say we are living the modern day civil rights movement 60 years later? Dr. King's letters, where he addressed the community leaders, he stated, "You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and preventing violence. I don't believe you would have so warmly commended the police force if you'd seen its angry, violent dogs literally biting 6 unarmed, nonviolent Negroes. I'm sorry that I can't join you in your praise for the police department." In the civil rights movement, people were being attacked left and right for taking a stand for peacefully doing so. According to We Shall Overcome, an article from the National Park Services.gov website, on May 2nd, 1963, police filled the jails in Birmingham with mass arrests and depleted the ranks of adult demonstrators. So the SCLC called on the city's children to join the protests. Under orders from Public Safety Commissioner, police arrested 600 children protesters, some as young as 6 years of age, and by the next day, 1,000 children had been jailed. In the days that followed, firemen blasted protesters, including children, with high-pressure fire hose, and police used their nightsticks. Police K-9 units loosed their dogs in a crowd of peaceful demonstrators, pinning down one woman and severely wounding 3 teenagers. One young bystander was whirled around by a policeman into the jaws of his German Shepherd. The peaceful protest Dr. King spoke about made me think of the Michael Brown case and how people protesting his cold-blooded murder were similar in ways I didn't see before. On August 9, 2014, an unarmed black teenager was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. It was said that the officer, Darren Wilson, fired 12 shots after pursuing Brown and Brown supposedly charging towards him. This incident, with a lot of others, outraged people all over the world, both black and white. So they banded together and started peaceful protests all over the world. These protests, which were supposed to be peaceful, turned into situations that those in the civil rights era had to face, which was also with more violence. After Mike Brown's death, peaceful protests were started in Ferguson, where people not showing any violence towards officers were being arrested, assaulted, and having foreign substances thrown on them. According to Radley Balco's article in the Washington Post titled After Ferguson, How Should Police Respond to Protests? He stated, the events these last few days in Ferguson, Missouri ought to be of grave concern to anyone who believes in the First Amendment, and specifically the rights to free speech, protest, and assembly. As you may have read, last night was particularly ugly as police arrested a St. Louis alderman. Huffington Post reporter Ryan J. Riley and our own Washington Post reporter Wesley Lowery. Police also tear-gassed a news crews from Algeria. There are reports, videos, and images of police tear-gassing, arresting, and otherwise intimidating peaceful protests all over the town. Politicians and government officials didn't see anything wrong with bringing militia tactics out for peaceful protests. This can be easily compared to what Dr. King addressed in his letter. The comparison of the freedom to protest from then until now seems as though the African American race as a whole has not progressed. Protesting these days have similar outcomes to the protests they had back in the Civil Rights era. Martin Luther King also stated in his letter that they were being locked up behind unjust laws. He states, let us turn to a more concrete example of just and unjust. An unjust law is a code that majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is the difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and that it is also willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. The segregation laws were one of the unjust laws that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. That segregation law was to keep African Americans below their white counterparts. The law was put in place so that African Americans couldn't go to the same places that their Caucasian counterparts didn't want them to and do things that they didn't want them to. The law made it hard for African Americans to be free because they could go to jail for simply drinking out of a whites-only water fountain instead of the dirty, rusty-colored only one. Dr. King's take on unjust and just laws made me think of the Stand Your Ground law in the Trayvon Martin case. On February 26, 2012, George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin, an unarmed 17-year-old teenager he followed, provoked, and pursued, and then was acquitted of murder under the Stand Your Ground law. According to the article titled The Color of Fear, a Cognate Rhetorical Analysis of How Florida's Subjective Fear Stand Your Ground Cases Ratifies Racism by Elizabeth Esther, and the Maryland Law Review studies reveal that the mere perception of race can bias judgment and criminality despite the absence of racial, anonymous, or overt racism. As a result, Black individuals are both more likely to be perceived as threatening and more difficult to be perceived as non-threatening than white individuals. This means that the basis of the Stand Your Ground law was for the majority and not the minority. According to Stand Your Ground laws, Homicides and Injuries by Chandler McClellan, published in the Journal of Human Resource, it's a fact that whites are more than twice as likely to own guns as blacks, and although 32% of Americans are white men, they make up 61% of gun owners. Just as Dr. Martin Luther King argued about unjust laws 50 plus years ago, it's still going on today with our minorities. White Americans are getting away with the Stand Your Ground law in higher rates than Black Americans. That law was being used to allow white murderers like George Zimmerman to get away with murdering the minorities like Trayvon Martin, when evidence at hand showed there was never a need to stand any ground because Zimmerman was the aggressor. The Stand Your Ground law and a bunch of others were made to benefit the majority and disadvantage the minority. It has been this way since the lawmakers first made the laws many years ago, when minorities like African Americans weren't looked at as equals but yet slaves. Dr. Martin Luther King goes on to say in his letter, "You spoke of the activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of extremists, which made me think about how social media today will try to not only stop African Americans from speaking up and fighting back, but also make it seem like protesting peacefully is extreme and very uncalled for. After many men and a few women were victims of being murdered by police, an outcry came from Americans, and the protests came in numbers. It was many articles and headline news stations shaming the protesters as if peaceful protesting wasn't warranted and the police departments weren't treating protesters as criminals. In conclusion, reading Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail from August of 1963 shows that not only we are living in the modern day civil rights era, but that African Americans may have gained equal rights now, but those equal rights aren't so equal. Dr. King addressed those 8 community leaders because they called Dr. King and other peaceful protesters protesting unwise and untimely, and that's what the community leaders, media, and government officials think when African American and those fed up with minorities being killed protest and take stands. Dr. King addressed how the cops were not protecting and serving anyone when it came to them peacefully protesting unjust, and it's the same today, maybe worse. Cops are killing minorities at an alarming rate and are getting away with it just as they got away with sending dogs, pepper spray, and using unnecessary force with protesters. That's nothing new today. Dr. King touched on the subject of laws being unfair and unjust then, and they are the same now, in laws like Stand Your Ground, where it benefits majorities and destroys minorities. Although the civil rights era in Dr. King is over, African Americans were considered equal 50 plus years ago. But are we really out of the civil rights era?